Hello there, I'm Corel Painter Master Rutten, and in this video I'm going to show you what's new in Corel Painter 2016. So the first thing you'll notice when you launch Painter is there's this nice welcome screen. You can learn about the new features. If we look under Get Content, there's packs of brushes that you can download. So if you want a whole bunch of flame brushes or a whole bunch of fur brushes, you can download those. You just click on Buy Now, and then you can purchase the brushes directly from Corel Painter. They'll install as soon as you purchase them, and they'll be permanently installed in Painter. So even if you reset your workspace, those brushes are still going to be there. They will show up in their own category in your brush library. You can get started by creating a new image or doing other common tasks. There's also some common workspaces, so if you're new to Painter, you might prefer this workspace that highlights the basic features. If you want to see what new brushes are in Painter, you could select this workspace, and so on. There's the Get Inspired tab, which you can cycle through to see some artwork by Corel Painter artists. I'm somewhere in here, right there. And then I have another image right here. So it's really cool to be included in this gallery. If you don't want to see this screen every time you start up Painter, just uncheck this box here. You can close the window here. And if you need to get that back, you can always go to Help, Welcome. So let's take a look at one of these new workspaces. Let's try New to Painter. That's going to rearrange all of the palettes in your workspace, and it's going to provide some options that are going to be really helpful to people who have never used Painter before, especially this Hints panel, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I'm just going to switch from the New to Painter workspace to my custom workspace, and then we'll take a look at some of the major new features in Corel Painter 2016. One of the changes that I like the most is the improvements to the blending. In older versions of Painter, if you were to use something like the coarse oily blender or maybe diffuse blur, you'll get these light or white pixels on your edges of your blending. That happens if you're working on a layer that's separate from your canvas. But if I switch to one of these newer brushes that uses the newer version of blending, which we can take a look at here, there's a new blending palette which has replaced the Well palette. You can choose Enhanced Layer Blending. And you can use this on any of your pre-existing blenders to make it work more properly. So if I use this updated coarse oily blender, you can see that I can blend and I don't get the white. If I use this speckle diffuse blur, I can blend the edges here and I don't get the same white pixel effect that I get when I use the regular diffuse blur. Let's try this on a transparent background using something like Just Add Water, which has been updated to Enhanced Layer Blending. So you can see I'm not adding any white at all. It's just blending to transparency. If I were to turn that off, I'm going to add white, and you can see it adds white paint that covers up that transparency rather than blending with it. If we turn the black back on, you can see exactly what Enhanced Layer Blending is doing. It's making it blend as it should, which I am really happy about. Let's run through the features on the blending palette. We have some presets. If you want a particular look for your blender, you can switch quickly between these. You can play with settings for resaturation and bleed. And if you hover over each of these sliders, you're going to get some feedback that tells you what each of these options does. That's really helpful. You can add bleed. There's brush loading if you want to pick up existing color. And there's dry out, which controls how the blending works. So for this particular brush, there's kind of a medium amount of dry out, so the brush kind of fades out. Dry out to transparency ensures that it kind of has that nice natural tapering to the end of the stroke. Let's take a look at a new blending type, which is called Grainy Alpha Blend. So I'm going to use the blender that's called Grainy Water 2. And this picks up a little bit of grain, but when it blends to transparency a little bit better than some of the other technologies do. If you look under the general panel, you can see Grainy Alpha Blend. So if you're making your own custom blenders, you can definitely try this out. It works a little bit better than some of the other options. Picks up a lot of grain, but if you want less grain, you can obviously turn your paper texture down and then you don't get as much. But it gives you some really, really natural looking blending results. The next major new feature that we'll take a look at is audio expression. You can now use audio input from your microphone, an instrument, or even music that you have playing on your computer to control the expressions of your brush strokes. So just like you can connect an expression for pen pressure to your brushes, you could now connect audio expression, and you could speak into your microphone and control the size or color or direction of the brush. You can do a lot of really cool things with it. So let's take a look at how to do that. You're going to need to access your audio palette from the window menu. We want the audio settings panel, and by default, audio input's turned off, so you want to make sure it's turned on. You can select your input. If you're going to be using a microphone, like the microphone on your laptop, then you'd want to select microphone. If you're going to play music on your computer, you'd want to choose internal audio. Same goes for if you were going to connect this to like a keyboard or some other instrument. So this is the audio settings palette. Now, strength and range we'll play with in just a minute here. Let's go ahead and select an audio brush. You can go to the audio expressions category and choose some brushes. I'm going to choose a few custom brushes that I created here. So since I have this set to internal audio, if I go over here to Winamp, which I use to play MP3s, and I play this royalty-free MP3 by Jingle Punks, let's see what happens when I use this brush. And you'll notice that on the drum beats, especially the louder ones, this particular brush expands and gets larger. Now when you click on an audio brush, you're going to get this dialog. This is meant to help you use the brush and set the settings to the correct settings, because some music doesn't respond as well as other music does, especially classical music, because it doesn't have a lot of drums and bass like something like R&B would. So you can go ahead and read this if you want to get a feel for what the settings do. If you don't want to see this every time you select a brush, then you're going to want to check do not show this again. If you need to get it back, it's in the preferences under general, and you just recheck this show using audio expression dialog box. We'll go ahead and start that music again, and let's take a look at this brush. I'm going to select a color. And you can see that while the music is kind of mellow, the brush isn't doing a whole lot. And if we look in this little decibel meter here, you can see that it's only moving a little bit in the green. We want it to be going nearly towards the end here. Green is showing that it's a good level, yellow will show that it's getting into too loud, and red is going to show that it's kind of getting cut off. So ideally you want it to be right in the yellow range, almost in red. So I'm going to turn up the strength, and you can see that that increases the strength of the audio input. So the brush is going to respond a little bit more aggressively to the changes in the music. Now, if you want to expand the range of that as far as how much of the music it's going to capture, is it going to capture the quiet parts, the loud parts, or everything? You can change the range. So I can decrease the range and the brush is going to respond to pretty much everything in the music, or I can increase the range and then it's going to just limit that to maybe the peaks in the audio. So you're going to get less of a response. So as I mentioned before, a lot of the brushes can be connected to audio. You want to look in the window menu and go ahead and open the brush control panels, general. That'll bring up all of your brush controls that are accessible. So let's say, for instance, we want to look at the brush size. We'll open that up. You can see that under expression, where there's normally pressure and direction and everything else, to the right of that is a little audio button, and you can check that to enable audio expression for the size. And you'll notice that that's on other things. For instance, if we look at color variability, there's color variability from audio input. So I think most everything that you could have an expression on for pressure and all of these other things, you can also have an expression for audio. So it's definitely worth experimenting with to see the different results that you get. The next major new feature we'll take a look at is dynamic speckles, and this is an entirely new type of brush. You can get really, really natural looking brush strokes now, because similar to the particle brushes, there are these little dots, these little speckles that follow your brush like a bristle would on a paintbrush. And you can control that in the dynamic speckles palette here. You can control the count. If you want more speckles, or if you want less speckles, you can reduce the count. If we reduce it really low, you can start to see each individual speckle. You can control the size of the speckles if you want them to be thinner. You can get some really interesting results from this brush. I mean, think about how well this will work for hair and grass and fur and all kinds of things. You get a lot of control out of this. You can control the size with pen pressure. You can also set that up to other expressions. And you can control the jitter, the randomness, smoothness, opacity, and all that stuff. So it's actually pretty cool. You can also play with the spacing if you want a more dotted look for your speckles, like so. The next new feature we'll take a look at is the ability to rotate papers and flow maps. And this is really handy because sometimes when you're using these papers, let's use this pebble board for example, I'm going to increase the scale and the contrast, and I'm just going to add a little bit of texture. No matter where I paint, and even if I pick up my pen, I'm always going to get that same direction of that texture. And it gets a little boring. You can, of course, scale the size down a little bit, and you get a little bit of variance, but it's not quite enough. Now you can rotate the paper texture, so you can see it rotating around like so. So I can rotate, paint a little bit more, rotate a little bit more, and paint, and I get much more variety in that texture. It looks way more organic and not so repetitive. And just like papers, you can rotate flow maps as well. So if I'm painting with watercolor and I want to make my flows look a lot more organic, or even just change the direction of the drips as if I were rotating the paper while it were drying, I can do that by rotating the paper. I can overlap these and I can get a much more organic result. Another new feature that's been added is the ability to import stamps or dabs from Photoshop. So if there's brushes that you use in Photoshop that you want in Painter, you can now import those. If you want to import a Photoshop brush, you go to Brushes, Import, New from Photoshop Brush Stamps, and then you'd select that Photoshop brush stamp file. That'll import it into Painter, and it will be in its own little category here. And last but not least on my list of new features is the ability to mix special media like impasto, watercolor, particle liquid ink, and speckles. And so for instance, I have this brush here that I created that is called Liquid Ink Splats. This is a liquid ink brush that takes advantage of one of these new brush types, which is liquid ink flow particles. So I'm combining liquid ink and particle technology together. Now you can also combine particle technology with watercolor. You can connect the dynamic speckles with the particle technology, and there's even dynamic speckle bristle. There's thin lines gravity particle, thin lines flow particle. There's all kinds of new combinations of things that you can create here. Let's take a look at another example of combining some of these technologies. Let's go to the particle brush called Flow Fur. This is how it looks normally. And if we go to the impasto palette, let's change this from draw to color in depth. And now we get this nice impasto effect along with our particle brush. Let's take a look at real watercolor. Here's a combination of real watercolor and speckle called Speckle Tiger Lily. Gives you some really interesting results. So I recommend you experiment with that to check out all the different combinations of brushes that you can create. So now let's take a look at some of the slightly less exciting changes that have been made to Corel Painter 2016. If you're using a high DPI resolution display, then you're going to notice that things are a lot cleaner and look a little bit better on those particular displays. You can also change the color scheme of your interface now. If you go to Edit, Preferences, and then Interface, there's color themes for dark gray. Frost is kind of a neutral kind of blue. Sepia is kind of a neutral kind of wood brown color. Now personally, I don't like to have color introduced into my workspace because I feel like it messes with my perception of color in my artwork. So I like this dark gray one better than the Frost or the Sepia. Let's try dark gray. Now it says we're going to have to restart Painter, of course. So let's click OK. Let's just restart Painter. And now you'll notice that things are slightly darker. And I like this a little bit better. It's not a perfect UI because it has a little bit too much light elements in it still, but it's definitely an improvement over the default version, so I'll definitely be using this one the most. Next on the list is the presentation or the full screen mode. If we go to Window, Presentation Mode, it's going to bring up this little dialog that says you're about to switch to presentation mode, and we can get to that down here in the toolbox. Let's go ahead and click on OK. And you can see that it got rid of the top and the bottom areas so that you get a little bit more room on your screen. So this will be really good for people who want to do live paintings and they don't want to have a whole lot of stuff on their screen while they paint. Now if I want to exit out of full screen mode, I can just click down here and then I can exit presentation mode like so. Let's go to Help and go to our Welcome menu, and let's take a look at the simple workspace layout. Let's click on that. And what this is going to do is this is going to arrange things in a very minimal way. You can see it got rid of all the palettes, but we have this simple toolbar here that has new file, save, undo, redo, cut, copy, paste. You can get to the layers really quick, put them away. You can get to the brush tracking, hints. If you want your brushes, you can get to them by category really easily. Here's the individual variants. And then you have just a few options on your toolbar for things that you'll use often, like the temporal color palette. So this is another way to minimize the amount of stuff that's on screen so that you can just focus on your artwork. There's also been some changes for both Windows and Mac for the background showing while you have documents open. If you go to Edit, Preferences, and then Interface, you'll notice that default view mode now has default or single document view. So single document view is just the new version of the full screen mode. So whatever document you have showing is going to be full screen. Now on Windows, there's always this gray background, but on Mac, sometimes you can see your desktop icons through this area. It's invisible instead of gray. So this is going to give you an option to kind of cover that up now. And if you want to switch between it, you can. So I'm going to choose single document view, click OK. You can see that it makes this document full screen. And then if I want to cycle between a few different documents that are open, I can hit Control Tab. And Control Tab will cycle between each of those open documents that you can see here. Next on my list of Painter 2016 new features are the changes that they've made to importing and exporting content from Painter. So for example, if I wanted to export this custom palette here and these brushes to perhaps send them to one of my students or make them available for download online, I'd have to do a few different things. For one, I would have to save variants for each of these brushes, and then I would have to save them all together into a custom category like this. Then all my brushes would be here in this huge long list. To sort them, I would put them into custom palettes like you have here, and I might even add custom icons like I've done. So then to send this to someone, I would have to do a couple different things. One could be just to export my workspace, which kind of packages everything together in one file, and then somebody else could import that workspace and it would set their Painter interface up just like I have mine here with all the brushes. The only problem with that is some people have their workspace set up the way they want it, and they don't want it to be rearranged exactly the way I have it. They might just want a particular palette or some particular brushes. So then what you'd have to do is you'd have to go to Custom Palette Organizer, and then you'd have to export the custom palette along with exporting the custom brush library, send someone both those files, and then they'd have to import both of those on their end to add them to their workspace. Now it's a lot easier. You can just go to Window, Custom Palette Organizer, and you can pick one of these palettes like the rendering palette, and you can save it as box. Now there's the older version of export, which is to save it as a palette, and again, as I mentioned, you'd have to save the custom palette and you'd have to save the brush category. If you save as box, it's going to automatically do that for you and package everything together. Now you can save brushes, you can save papers, you can save shortcut buttons, and you can save patterns. There's some things that aren't supported, like image hose nozzles, for instance. And what will happen is when you import one of these boxes, it will open as its own particular category. It'll have all the brushes in it automatically, so when somebody goes to click in the palette, they'll get the brush that they wanted and you don't have to do as many steps to share content. There's also been some improvements for importing legacy content. So if I were to import a Corel Painter workspace from Corel Painter 2015 into Corel Painter 2016, there's going to be a lot better chances that things work as they were supposed to, because sometimes when you import older workspaces, there's particular brushes that don't work or certain features that don't work. So now you should have a little bit more compatibility if you want to bring in some of your older workspaces into the new version of Painter. There's also improved options to reset your workspace. So occasionally things can go wrong, and if Painter isn't performing like it should and you're having issues getting it to start, or it's glitching out, or there's crashes or anything like that, typically you'd want to reset your workspace. And to do that, you would hold down Shift and you'd double click on the icon to open Painter. And normally what you'd get is just an option to restore all settings to factory defaults, and you could reset all the workspaces or just the current workspace. And what that would do is reset Corel Painter to its default settings, and it would throw away any customization that you added, like custom palettes or brushes or papers or things like that. now you have the option to keep some customizations. So you can say, okay, go ahead and reset Painter, get it working as it should, but I still want to keep my brushes, or I still want to keep my papers, or I still want to keep my custom palettes, or I want to keep everything. I just want to reset Painter to its default setting otherwise. So you would keep your customizations, and then you would reset all workspaces, and then when you reload Painter again, any content that you chose to preserve would still be there. So this is helpful if you do something like upgrade to Corel Painter 2016 from an older version, and maybe you have a workspace that you've imported and that workspace isn't working correctly. You could reset your workspace, but choose to keep all of the brushes and all the customization, and that'll hopefully make it a little more compatible with Corel Painter 2016. Next on the list of what's new in Corel Painter 2016, overall Corel Painter 2016 is faster and more stable than Corel Painter 2015 and previous versions. The user interface is now optimized to be more intuitive. So for instance, if I open up my brush controls, I can hover over these different dialogues and get tooltips. So this tooltip shows me how to use the particle brushes. What does smoothness do? What does local chaos do? If we go to liquid ink, we can see what volume does, or what the thickness does for ink droplets, or volume jitter, or size jitter. So most of these different options here that were once kind of confusing and esoteric now have little descriptions to tell you how to use each of those features. There's also, if you look under Window, the new Hints panel, and Hints will give you even more details. So right now I have a liquid ink brush selected. It's telling me all about how liquid ink brushes work. And I can see all the details with little visual examples. This also links you to help. So if I click on liquid ink, it's going to open up the Corel Painter help guide, and that'll give me even more information. So this Hints is kind of a way to get a little bit of brief information, and then if you want to know even more, you can open up the help. Next on the list, the brush library for Corel Painter 2016 has been streamlined. There's now about 350 or so brushes. That's down from about 850 in Corel Painter 2015. So you'll notice that some of the categories have been combined. Acrylics and gouache have been combined. Pens and pencils have been combined. And there's a lot fewer variants per category so that you don't have to scroll quite as much. You can see that blenders has really been shaved down to just the essential blenders. Now don't worry, all of the brushes that you love in Corel Painter 2015 can still be used. You just want to look under the Corel Painter 2015 library, and then you'll have all of those brushes with the same categories that they were in the last version. And any new variants that have been added will be here as well. But the brush library for Corel Painter 2016 should be a bit snappier and a bit faster. You'll notice that there's a lot of brushes that have 2. That means that they've been updated to some of the new technologies. So maybe they've had the dynamic speckle technology added, or maybe they've had the enhanced blending added. So for instance, in the blenders, there's Coarse Oily Blender 2, which works a little bit better, Grainy Water 2, and so on. So that's it for the major features. Of course, there were a lot of little improvements that make the Corel Painter experience better in 2016. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, take a quick second to click the like button, share this video with your friends, and if you're new to my channel and you'd like to see more Corel Painter videos and tutorials, click that subscribe button to get updates when I release new videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.